Great, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Kerry Brown, I'm the director of the Lau China Institute at King's College London, and it is a great honour to do this event with the Policy Institute, our wonderful colleagues here, and we are talking about the sort of endlessly fascinating subject of US-China relations. Today we've launched online a report. I did it with my colleague Shafali Shah. It's a kind of simple overview. I mostly deal with China, but of course anyone who deals with China ends up having an opinion on US-China relations, and everyone else also has an opinion on this hugely important relationship. We did look at some data, you know, the standard stuff, of course, which you'll find in the report about the empirics. You know, I think there is still this world of fact. I mean, I think it's still out there somewhere, and we're sending a search party out to find it. But I mean, that proved that in terms of trade, the US-China relationship is still a massive relationship. And the figures, they've come down, and during the previous sort of tariff wars or trade wars in 2018, they sort of came down, then they went shooting up during the pandemic bilateral trade. But it's always around about 600 billion US dollars a year. I mean, that's been the sort of same, which is about what Elon Musk is worth. So, I mean, that's not that much, but I mean, it's still a huge amount of money. We also looked at investments. You can see that's a bit like the story in Britain, where investments, it's still, in America, it's about 28 billion, I think, in 2024 of Chinese investments. That's a significant figure. But in terms of, I think, the overall foreign direct investment that year in America was 5.4 trillion. So, you know, it's still a tiny, tiny proportion. Despite that, it's a relationship that is just going to obviously be overshadowing everything else. An ex-official from the previous Trump administration was speaking recently and said, you know, if you want to catch the current president's attention, you just put China in the meeting title or whatever, and, you know, there's immediate engagement. Most other relationships do not get that kind of profile. It is also clear, as we write in the report, that the Chinese have thought hard about how they're going to deal with this, you know, new dilemma or new opportunity. And I guess with the excellent panelists I got, who I'll introduce in a moment, you know, what I would really like to hear their views on, I suppose, is, to me, it looks like everything so far is a big opportunity for China. I mean, it looks like there's lots of space opening up, and I just sort of wonder, is it maybe not too much of an opportunity? It's like an open goal. But probably, I guess, I'm misunderstanding something. So it's great to get the informed voices of colleagues to kind of really understand this great disorientating moment. At the heart of this, if one assumes one has a highly transactional president, which I'm assuming, there is the idea that possibly there's some kind of deal, you know, some big deal between the US and China. I was looking at a presentation the other day by someone in the corporate, and they were talking about the options that China had. And China has got a number of options as it goes through this potential big transaction. It has diversification with the global south, as it used to be called. I don't know what it's called now, but, you know, it has like the Huawei world, the world that Huawei does business in, Latin America, Africa, Middle East, where its markets are huge. I mean, China has options in these markets that it might be able to pursue. It has things it can do in its domestic economy, even though there's been great turbulence recently. And I suppose at the heart of that is this entrenched issue of the consumption of Chinese, particularly the middle class, and the way that that has been sort of stuck for so long, you know, at about a third of GDP. There are ways in which a transactional approach to America might be able to kind of do something about that. That seems to be a massive unexploited economic asset, and one that possibly China might be able to find ways of dealing with different relations with America as a trading partner, possibly. There are also options that China can do in the multilateral system that it's set up. I mean, the BRICS network, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I mean, it has all of these. The Belt and Road Initiative, which has been rather kind of under, not massive profile recently. I was in China in August and September last year. It didn't seem that Belt and Road Initiative was talked about a great deal. It was more about common prosperity. But I mean, that is a sort of enormous network that China can deal with. And finally, what it's doing with technology. And again, in the report, we give some data on that. I mean, an indicative figure, but China's investment in research and development annually, according to the National Bureau of Statistics in Beijing, is about 420 billion US dollars. And I mean, in Britain, in the last budget, our investment, approximately dollar value, was about 22 billion US dollars. I mean, China is obviously doing with DeepSeek incredibly important new things. It is no longer just if it ever was an imitator, it's definitely an innovator of some kind now. And so we're trying to kind of work out how that impacts on this overall relationship. So I would like to invite the speakers onto the stage in their allocated places, please, to join me in this discussion. The idea is that they will each make comments for a few minutes, 6 or 7 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A and a discussion. And we will aim to close at about 7:45, and then there'll be refreshments afterwards. So thank you very much for coming. I'm really, really grateful. And now we'll kick off. And if I could ask the first speaker, Andrew People, who is a journalist, worked in China for
3 years.
3 years. Yeah. So has experience there. He will talk about the economic situation at the moment, and then we'll ask Leslie and then Bill. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks, Kerry, and thanks so much for having me. Obviously, great to be in such distinguished company. It's a great honor. And thanks to all of you for coming to listen. Kerry asked about the potential opportunity for China, and I've sort of been looking at this more on the kind of from the point of view of trying to work out what Trump is planning vis-a-vis China over the next few years. And of course, I'll proviso this with nobody knows, right? Who knows what's going through Trump's mind exactly? You're not always sure he knows, but just trying to think about this. One of the most interesting things we've done at The Wire over the last few years is a series of interviews that by a former colleague of mine at Wall Street Journal, Bob Davis, with sort of policymakers from the US over the last 30 years or so, from people like Charlene Barshevsky and Nancy Pelosi, and then through to sort of the likes of Matt Pottinger and others that served under Trump. And, you know, the big sort of dividing question that runs through those interviews is, did America make a huge mistake back in the 90s by engaging with China economically and, you know, facilitating China's entry into the WTO? And, you know, the likes of Pottinger and so on say this is a huge mistake, and, you know, it's been bad for ultimately been bad for the US economy, but it's also, you know, people were delusional in thinking that China would become a free market democracy. And the counter to that is obviously people will say, well, if we hadn't let them into the WTO, we'd have lost China forever back then. And it actually, you know, for many years, there were good things that, you know, it's enabled us to have cheap iPhones, and, you know, at the macro level, China's bought up US treasuries, and that's helped fund the US deficits. But, you know, over time, what's clear is that by the time you get to, you know, through the sort of Obama administration after the financial crisis, and then by the time Trump comes along, there's a sort of plausible argument that can be made, and Trump makes it, that, you know, that engaging with China has been bad for America. It's led to a whole loss of jobs. They've undercut the US economy. At the same time, you can sort of argue that China's not played by the rules. There's been intellectual property theft. They've subsidized their industries to a great extent. They've manipulated their currency, that sort of thing. And, and at the same time, America increasingly feels that, or at least the Trump camp feels that things like the World Trade Organization are useless. You can't resolve anything through that. Multilateralism doesn't work. You've got to do this bilaterally. And it's also clear, in the years running up to Trump that, you've got Xi Jinping. He's a more assertive type of Chinese leader. They're doing things with the Belt and Road Initiative. They're doing things that America doesn't like. And they're promoting a whole bunch of industries, things like Made in China 2025. They're clearly aiming to become dominant in a series of important industries. And so this all fits into a narrative that you see with Trump the first time around, that chimes with his sort of core MAGA voters, that it's all unfair, China's cheating, the fact that America is still the most prosperous country in the world and, still the strongest, forget all that. We're being cheated, and China is the number one cheat. And so in the Trump administration, you get the phase one trade agreement, you get tariffs, and so on. Then under Biden sort of continues much of that and strengthens it in some ways by putting export controls designed to sort of do down Chinese industries and Chinese advances. And he sort of talks about managed competition with China. So where are we now with Trump just coming back into office? Well, it's sort of a mixed picture of what the combination of Trump 1 and Biden has achieved. As Kerry said, the US bilateral trade deficit with China has come down a bit, but it's still massive, and America's still importing, $400 billion plus of goods a year from China. And, more to the point, even though the bilateral trade deficit is coming down, America's overall trade deficit isn't really coming down at all, and that's because, there's sort of structural reasons why that's not happening. At the same time, you've seen the fact that despite the export controls, China's made advances. Huawei was able to produce a smartphone with pretty advanced chips. We've seen recently, obviously, the DeepSeek furore, which seemed to show that China, despite export controls and so on, is still being able to do very well in artificial intelligence. And at the same time, you see a lot of American businesses seeming to a bit of a tipping point for American and Western businesses in China. A lot of them now souring on the country, sort of feeling they're never actually going to make the breakthrough in the markets there that they'd hoped for. Apple is losing ground to homegrown smartphone makers, for example. Obviously, China's car makers are charging ahead of their US and Japanese rivals and so on. And you look at the sort of surveys of chambers of commerce; they're all pretty negative now on China. So essentially, we're still, after all this time, we've still got the same question as Trump comes back into office, which is, what kind of economic relationship does America actually want with China? But also, is there a way that we can change China? Is there, and not so much now, the question of changing China's political system, that's gone, I think, but what the optimist might say is there's an opportunity now to try and change China's economic system, which is more favorable, i.e. try and persuade China to increase, put more reliance on its own domestic consumption, less reliance on exports, and so on. Now, I think obviously in the early weeks of Trump, there's been a lot going on, as we all know. On the China side, it's been relatively quiet, I'd say. I mean, we've seen the increase in tariffs, the 10% increase in tariffs, but that's way below what Trump was floating on the campaign trail of tariffs of up to 60%. He's gone pretty soft on the whole TikTok debate about banning TikTok. It seems that he doesn't really want to do that. But there's a bit of an issue with the whole Trump economic agenda. If you go by conventional economic theory, the tariffs that he's imposing, not just in China, but that he's proposing globally, are going to be inflationary. If you ally that with the big tax cuts that he's talking about domestically in the US, all other things being equal, that's going to lead to higher inflation, higher interest rates from the Fed, and a stronger dollar. And those are things that Trump doesn't actually want. At the same time, he wants to, he talks about, or at least the Republicans talk about cutting the US's sort of persistently high fiscal deficit. But if you're going to do that, forget all this stuff about US aid. That's not going to make much difference. What you're going to have to do is cut one of the big line items, just like any developed country, and one of those is defense. And so these sort of dilemmas, to me, that makes where the actual personnel that Trump's gathered around himself this time pretty interesting. And my colleague Noah Berman, who's in the audience, has done quite a lot of work on this, detailing the sort of biographies of the different characters there. And you still have the sort of out-and-out hawks, the sort of Peter Navarro types, who are pretty hawkish on China. And you have, we had an interview yesterday with Tom Cotton. I know he's not in the administration, but a leading Republican senator, fire-breathing about communist China, and how terrible it is and how it's looking to supplant the United States. You have those sorts of people. But interestingly, you have people like Scott Bessent, who's the Treasury Secretary now, who's talked about how he wants to be at the center of a reordering of global trade and capital flows. And of course, you have Elon Musk, who's got his substantial business in China and huge supply chains there. So then the question is, to my mind, is Trump looking for some sort of grand deal with China? And, in a sense, what's happening now with Ukraine and Gaza, he's sort of trying to clear the decks with that, and then he's going to focus on China and maybe look for a grand deal. And the grand deal runs something like, the US says, in return for cutting the tariffs and lowering the dollar back down again, you commit to certain reforms of your economic system that boost domestic demand, make you less reliant on flooding exports into the world. And in that way, we can reduce our trade deficit with you. And if we come to a suitable deal, maybe we can even, he's floated this idea of China, Russia, and America agreeing to halve their defense budgets, which would obviously go a long way to helping Trump cut the overall US deficit. And you've seen it, it's pretty interesting to see Graham Allison, who's the sort of academic who's proposed the whole idea of US and China heading for war and the Thucydides trap. He wrote a piece in the Washington Post the other day saying he's pretty optimistic about US-China relations under Trump for these sorts of reasons. So maybe that's the sort of grand deal that Trump or some of the people around Trump are hoping to pursue. Then, of course, the question is, well, does China play ball? And there are a host of reasons why maybe China wouldn't, I suspect. One of them is obviously that even though, with 4 years of Trump stretching ahead of us, we're all sort of varying degrees of concern about what's going to happen. For the Chinese, and they can see the end, right? 4 years, Trump's, even after the midterms, perhaps he loses some of his power. Maybe they can see this out. They don't need to do a big deal with the US. Perhaps also, the Chinese have obviously put a lot of resources into building up their industries in electric vehicles and solar power and so on and so forth. So are they going to want to sacrifice all of that? And maybe they see an opportunity now with what's going on over Ukraine to get closer to Europe. As Kerry said, China does have alternative markets for its exports in the global south and potentially even Europe more and more as a result of what we're seeing now. So it seems to me far from a foregone conclusion that China will take any opportunity that the Trump administration offers in this way. But that's, who knows whether any of this is how it's going to pan out. But I just wanted to offer that as a potential scenario of what's going on at the moment.
That's a great conclusion, isn't it? Who knows? Great. Well, thanks, Andrew. There's Stephen Murray, who's an old colleague at Chatham
Old.
House.
Very old.
No.
As well as former.
A esteemed colleague for many years at Chatham House. Well, I was there for a long time. So
You're
came
old
later.
also.
I'm older. So, actually, in your comments, what would be great is also, as you've followed American foreign policy for, over the years, what does Trump want?
Yeah, what does Trump want? We've all become Trump whisperers, haven't we? First of all, thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here with the panelists in front of one of Britain's leading scholars of China, very humbling, Isabel Hilton. And many of you, I'm sure, know a lot more about China than I do. Nonetheless, I'll take the opportunity, and I appreciate it a huge amount. I guess let me say a couple of things, building on some of what you've said. Part of it is 4 weeks and 1 day, by my count, since Donald Trump was inaugurated as U.S. president, and it's been an extraordinary 4 weeks. You said a grand deal at the end, and I thought grandiose, which is a word that we often associate with narcissists. But I guess on a more serious point, one of the challenges of the current moment. How many of you are students at King's? All right, so you get a very public audience. One of the things that we try to do with our students is to teach them, deeper ways of thinking about big relationships in international relations and about questions of international order. And for a long time, until we hit the Trump moment, or frankly, until we hit the Trump 2.0 moment, I think that we had a reasonable lens through which to debate the U.S.-China relationship. And a lot of it was about, the extent to which it was structurally determined. You referred to Thucydides. There are plenty of great scholars out there to refer to. But in a sense, there's been an abiding belief that this relationship could be managed, but that as China's share of global GDP has grown, is it around 18% now? And the U.S., I think, is it around 26%? I mean, these are two very large powers after which everything else pales in comparison. We like to talk about multipolarity, but really when it comes to great power politics, we've had a framework increasingly of two dominant powers, and which also then, once you move beyond the question of materiality, have different ideological systems, different regimes, very different histories and values. And there's been an inevitability, not that there would be war, although some people believe that, but that there would be conflict and confrontation. And the challenge has been about how that's managed. And, you referred to the Bob Zoellick responsible stakeholder thesis that led to China's admission to the World Trade Organization in 2001. And the belief grounded in liberal international relations theory, and frankly, most of Washington at the time, although some resisted it, that by integrating major powers into the liberal international order, and especially its economic institutions, that we could change them and that they would become more like us, more liberal, more open, potentially even democratic, more fair in their trade practices, and that this would, reap all good things for all good people. And I would argue, and maybe we differ a little bit on this, that certainly the people on the national security and geopolitical side of the U.S. foreign policy elite tend to think that bet was a failed bet, a failed promise, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. And as that's become the case, we started to hear about a bipartisan consensus forged in the United States that China was the only country with the ability and the desire to rival American power, to displace American power, to set the agenda and the structure and the norms and the rules and everything that matters in the international order, and that this is a threat to be managed. And therein, thereafter, in my view, we sort of overstated the bipartisan consensus, and thereafter came the divide in U.S. policy and foreign policy in particular about how you then play that out. So an agreement on the threat. And then increasingly that elite agreement became reflected in the public opinion polling. By the time you get through COVID, through China's moves on Hong Kong, through Trump's ability to assign blame very visibly and vocally to China for the COVID origins and the virus, the pandemic, and Huawei becomes another reason for Trump to really mobilize the anti-China sentiment. It becomes locked in. That competition with China becomes locked in, not only at the level of foreign policy elites, but also amongst ordinary Americans, even though there's a bit of a divide with Republicans being more fixated on China and Democrats being a little bit more fixated on Russia. Still, there is a structural conflict and an underpinning to it that through Trump frankly, starting with Obama, right, where Obama's trying to pivot to Asia, pull out of the Middle East, but doing it through creating multilateral free trade deals in the Indo-Pacific in which the U.S. would engage and benefit and China would be excluded. But through Obama and Trump and Biden, we still saw differences in policy, but continuity in that basic perspective, and especially as China's GDP, military capabilities, many would argue assertiveness, but its general power grew, that entrenchment and that sort of locked-in battle grew. So one word on Biden and then a few words on Trump. Again, we get to Biden and we think we know where we're going with China. We think that we're in a position where things are getting, Pompeo at the end of Trump 1.0 took it into a very ideological contest, not just a structural contest. At some level, Biden continued that. He starts his administration talking about autocracies versus democracies. And, the top autocracy on the out is obviously China. And he takes Trump's agenda of tariffs and competition and he makes it deeper, right? He moves into, as you've outlined, more export controls and more comprehensive economic battle with China, and also a domestic agenda, which is about investing in America's industry and its climate policies. Invest in America, align with like-minded states, especially Europeans, and compete with China. That's Biden. So we really think we know where we're going, for better or for worse, right? People disagreed and debated the policy. But it was deemed to be, because China's that structural peer competitor that any U.S. president would take issue with and have it an aligned policy towards. And then we get to Trump, and suddenly all priors, there's a moment where we're like, we've lost our priors. We've lost our sight of whether this is truly a structural competition that is, about something more than just, what does Donald Trump think and what does Scott Bessent think and what does Mike Waltz and Marco Rubio and what do they think and what about Elon Musk and who's going to have, more control? And we've ceased to talk about, the broader structural confrontation, in part because there is a lot of concern, I think, that this U.S. president, Donald Trump, in this second term is not necessarily going to follow the structural incentives that are offered by the system, nor the constraints, nor the competition that a rationally minded U.S. president, even if they differ on the question to which ideology should or shouldn't matter, we have a sense that Donald Trump is going to stray. He's not going to, look at the GDP, look at the sea lanes, look at all these things, and he might just sort of randomly do something. And that's why I think we're in this very strange moment, and it's not just on China, on pretty much everything, where we've stopped being analytical because it's not clear that we can be analytical. And so I think I say that as it is a funny comment, but it's actually deeply serious. And this is why I think this is the most concerning moment of international relations that I personally have ever lived through. So 2 quick things. You could say that what we're seeing from Trump so far is quite realist before you get to China. That there is a notion that he sees the international order, he sees that the international liberal part of the order hasn't really been delivering for the US, that it has been delivering for China, that America's become preoccupied in the Middle East, and then with respect to Ukraine, and that needs to be changed. So the first part of what he's trying to do, even though it's terrifying to people here in Europe, and it probably is terrifying, although hopefully the structure will pull him back to the center. I still believe it might. But what he's trying to do is to move us possibly, and I think this would be bad if he does it, to a world where there is some sense not of a liberal international order, but a world where there are spheres of influence. And Russia has, and I say this not because I agree with it, but because I think it is, his first play. I think he's going to fail. But I think his first play is to recognize that Russia has a legitimate security concern, a legitimate sphere of influence, that the U.S. doesn't want to invest in altering that because it has bigger fish to fry. And so therefore he's trying with Russia. The second question then is, what does that mean with China? The logical extension of that would be to have some sort of accommodation, going back to a G2, the proposals that, are dead in the water, so we thought, where China gets, its fair share and the things that matter to it. It has Hong Kong. And obviously Taiwan is the next question. But that logic doesn't really fit with America's geoeconomic interests, with its concern with sea lanes, with open trade. It doesn't really fit with the domestic bipartisan anti-China consensus that has built up over all of these years. And so even the kind of broad brush deal, grand deal or grandiose deal, I think will run into a wall. And I would add maybe a couple of other reasons why it will run into a wall. One is that Europe and the rest of the world have to sort of play ball with that deal. And right now, Donald Trump's domestic agenda, but also his foreign policy agenda with respect to Ukraine and Europe are potentially going to push Europe in a direction that the U.S. doesn't really want them to go. If not into the hands of being much more openly engaged with China, certainly into the hands of being multi-lined and non-committal to the U.S. So I think on that dimension, the U.S., at some point, the rubber will hit the road and the United States will realize that it needs partners and also allies for some of the things that it would like to achieve. There's a broader conversation, I guess, that we can come back to at some point about the global South and what this means and what the stakes are. But if you just, I guess I would close with just saying, if you just think about Africa and the scale of growth and the importance of the markets, there will be a moment, it might be after Trump 2.0, when the U.S. is going to wake up to the need to be competitive in that market. And the grand bargain that some of us think, might be on the cards or might be somewhere in the back of Donald Trump's mind is also going to run into a brick wall when it comes to what the U.S. will want, but also need at some point in the rest of the world. And then I guess just final points is that all of this hope that there is some strategic thinking coming out of, if not Donald Trump, the broader administration, I think is belied by the very unfortunate reality that President Trump seems to have, if not himself, he's committed to a group of folks that have done serious thinking and have a very rigorous agenda that's being implemented across the whole of the U.S. government, but also across U.S. society. And at some level, the imperative and the desire to implement that agenda is actually going to undercut President Trump's ability to execute on a more strategic foreign policy agenda, in my view.
Well made. Well, sobering thought.
Sobering
Thoughts.
thought.
Great. Well, look, Bill, cheer us up. Bill is at Cambridge, but has done lots of research on Asia more generally, so can give that perspective. Bill Hurst.
Sure. Thank you very much. So I would begin actually the way I usually begin talking to undergraduates about the U.S.-China relationship over a long time, which is that there's a structural international system dimension to it, and there's a domestic politics, more contingent dimension to it. And the structural international system dimension is basically is there or is there not at any given moment in time a state actor in the world system that presents a very serious or even existential threat to both the United States and China at the same time? So we can think of two instances since 1900 where this has been true quite powerfully. During the Second World War, Japan was the common enemy, quite clearly. During the latter phase of the Cold War, at least, the Soviet Union was the common enemy, all the way up until it collapsed. When there is such a situation, the US and China cooperate on security or strategic dimensions. The domestic politics, or more contingent side of this, has to do with whether or not both the United States and China, at any given moment in time, are governed by coalitions or leadership groups that are committed to globalization and the expansion of international trade as fundamental to their own country's economic growth potential. So we can see this, for example, during the 1980s, during the 1990s. Since 2002, that has not been the case, right? Hu Jintao, when he comes in and begins talking about things like 科学发展 and 以人为本, and all of these slogans of his first term, has thrown away the emphasis that Deng Xiaoping, and to a much greater extent actually Jiang Zemin, had on using globalization and the expansion of international trade to drive China's growth agenda. After the world economic crisis in 2008, 2009, we see basically the collapse of China's export-led development model, and that never really recovers. So as early as 2010, I was at a conference in Beijing, and policy actors were enunciating very clearly the need to not rely on the global economy, to rely instead on domestic demand and consumption. There was a clear recognition that aggregate investment was way too high as a share of the economy, that the return on investment was the lowest in the world, and that there was a need really to upgrade many sectors and to upgrade domestic demand and domestic consumption. That was in 2010, right? And it was generally agreed at that time and in that forum that this consensus had existed in Chinese policy circles for at least several years, predating even the economic crisis of 2008, 2009. If we look at the Made in China 2025 plan that came out soon after that, we see clear evidence again of this agenda. If we look at the Shuangxuanhuan doctrine of Xi Jinping, which is the closest thing he has to a comprehensive economic policy, it's also about upgrading domestic demand and reducing the share of global engagement and international trade in China's GDP growth picture. Right? So these things that Andrew was talking about earlier have been part of the picture for a long time. But it is also part and parcel of a political shift away from a strong commitment to globalization and toward a prioritization of the domestic economy. I would argue we see the same thing in the United States since about the same time. With the end of the Clinton era, we see increasingly a shift towards more and more protectionist policies, whether that's Obama, Bush the Lesser from 2000 to 2008, Trump 1, Biden, Trump 2. They get more and more and more protectionist, more and more domestically focused. And so that means there's a lack of cooperation between the US and China on trade or economic dimensions of the relationship, right? If both countries have this kind of pro-global coalition in power, like in the 80s or the 90s, they do cooperate on the economy, even if they're not cooperating on security, which was the case, for example, during the 1990s, after the Soviet Union was gone. Right? So it's not odd that we should expect over a long arc, basically a competitive, confrontational, or not really very engaged relationship from the US and China for about the last 25 years, which is in fact what we have seen. Right? So in that sense, Trump is not so much the aberration, but rather the continuation of a trend that has been in place for decades and that shows little sign, frankly, of changing in the near future. So that's one situation that we find ourselves in. So this fact that there's not a good relationship is not a surprise. The second thing is there's a lot of talk on the panel today, in the media, and elsewhere about what will Trump do? What are his choices? Right? And he has this kind of a trilemma when it comes to China. right? He can go for this grand bargain and divide the world into spheres of influence. And I'll talk in a minute about what that implies at a more macro theoretical level for how we understand the relationships between different global powers, different blocs, different parts of the world, etc. But that's one option. Option two would be to continue in a concerted, systematic, and careful way to confront China over both security and economic areas of the relationship. That seems to be what many people in the administration would like to pursue, notably, for example, Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State. Whether or not he has the clout to make that happen, I don't know, within the administration. There are other voices in the administration that are less clearly in support of such an agenda. A third option is the kind of wild card option to do something rash, to do something orthogonal to any line of thinking that we might usually conceive of as in line with a particular policy agenda or set of priorities. That could happen. I have no idea if it will, right? I cannot predict what this administration or this president might do, and I think actually that's part of the point. To the extent Trump is a strategic thinker, I think part of that strategy is indeed to keep everyone guessing, to keep on the table that possibility of wild or crazy action that no one would or could expect. If that happens, I have no idea how that affects the China relationship. But let's look at the other two. I'll come back to the grand bargain in a minute. But if he engages in this kind of concerted and pointed confrontational policy, what's the implication for China? How should or might China respond to this? Over about the last 6 months, there has in fact been a pretty vigorous debate inside Chinese political and policy circles and academia about exactly this question. That debate became far more intense and focused after the election and before the inauguration. And I think increasingly there has come a consensus in that conversation, and that consensus has crystallized really around a 4-point plan, if you would, although it's not been adopted to my knowledge as a formal plan. Right, but sort of 4 pillars of a possible reaction. And I think it's actually quite an astute reaction to what at least China perceives of Trump. And China perceives 2 things of Trump that I think are important to remember before I talk about the 4 points. The first is that Trump's overall policy orientation is part and parcel of a longer-term American withdrawal, almost an abdication of leadership in the global arena. And this, again, dates back to Obama, right? It dates back to 2008 and the campaign of Obama saying, let's not fight dumb wars, let's pull back, let's focus more on growing things at home, right? All of this agenda. Trump clearly is borderline isolationist, right? He's not interested in global leadership, playing a role in global institutions, et cetera, et cetera. So the US is in a state of retreat from global leadership. That's one perception. And we could argue about whether that perception is accurate, but that certainly, I think, is the consensus view in China of what the United States is doing. The second point, which is a much more controversial point in terms of characterizing any consensus in China, speaks back to something Leslie alluded to, which is Trump is a narcissist, right? And so if you assume that he's a narcissist and that the United States is in retreat from global leadership, these 4 points quite clearly follow. The first, ignore him as much as possible. What do you do with a narcissist? The archetype of a narcissist, right, is a child throwing a tantrum on the floor. How do you fix that problem? Walk away, right? Ignore Trump as much as possible. Not absolutely that he's a child on the floor, although that's an interesting image, perhaps, that was popular in the first term among some protesters. But if you think of him as somebody who craves and demands attention, right, who's crying out, pay attention to me, react to this, I'm going to take this strong action against you, you better do something, just ignore it. Or respond only symbolically and in the lightest possible way, as in fact China has to the latest escalation of the tariff row. So the first point is ignore him as much as possible. The second point is spin losses into wins. And what I mean by that is increased tariffs on China, more restrictions on Chinese trade with the US, etc., are a loss for China. That's true, right? They're not necessarily a win for the US, right? International trade is not a scorecard. There's no such thing as deficits and surpluses. I'll come back to that in a minute when we talk about theories of global trade. But if we think about sort of what that means, this increase in tariffs and restrictions, it will hurt China economically. Certain firms, certain sectors will be hurt more than others, but it's not good for China. It won't destroy China, but it's not good. Now, in fact, China has much more important trade relationships with other parts of the world than the United States, as has also been alluded to. By far, China's largest single trading partner now is ASEAN. And the countries of ASEAN together constitute something like twice the volume of trade that the United States does with China, right? Behind ASEAN, the next big trading bloc for China is the European Union, specifically the Eurozone, right? So Europe actually could matter in this in a certain way, but the Eurozone trade is not really growing. The ASEAN trade is growing rapidly. Other areas of world trade for China, including Japan and South Korea, but also parts of, not just Africa, which has already been mentioned, Latin America, South Asia. These areas are growing rapidly in terms of trade relationship with China. So the harm from this is manageable. The potential gain, the way you spin this into a win, is to play the narrative of, look, we really are the victim here. It's the United States that's gone crazy and is hurting us, striking out irrationally, A. But B, much more importantly, who's the reliable partner? Who's the reliable guarantor of a global free trade order? Is it the United States anymore? Or is it us? Right? If you're sitting in Beijing, you want to spin that second narrative quite well. And so far, pretty good. They've been pretty successful at doing that. The third point is to try to fill gaps where possible, right? As the United States withdraws and retreats, that will open gaps. When those gaps open, it's important to try to fill them, right? And by filling those gaps, but it doesn't always mean that that's the best option or the most feasible option, right? China will not fill every gap. But when it's feasible and when it makes sense, fill the gap. And then the fourth point is actually related to something I just said on the second, which is to play the larger global narrative of now China can be the more responsible global leader, now that the US no longer is, right? So that's kind of the 4-point strategy of response. Now, to speak very quickly to two other points, and then I'll stop. The first is related to this issue of systems of global trade. And really this goes back to a much, much, much older argument. And so if you listen to Colbert, as in Jean-Baptiste, not Stephen, right? But if you listen to Colbert and you see the world in terms of a general kind of mercantilist orientation on which Colbert sold Louis XIII and XIV quite successfully, you're really concerned about the balance of capital flows into versus out of your country, right? And you want more money flowing in than flows out, right? And so in those days, it was gold bullion flowing into France versus other goods and services and so on flowing out. And that is, I think, to a large extent, the way Donald Trump seems to see the world, or certainly how he portrays his vision of the world when he talks about economic policy. That's not the way global trade has worked for the last 100 years or so. And it's absolutely not the way that people in this country or the United States wanted global trade to work since about 1650, right? And since about that point, people were listening much more to others like David Ricardo, who said more trade is good trade, right? It doesn't really matter if there's more money flowing out or flowing in. More trade in the aggregate is better, and trade will follow comparative advantage. And everyone's winning from a greater trading relationship. And so if you believe in free trade and open markets, the kind of policy that Trump is pursuing is antithetical to the advancement of that free trade agenda. And so what we're left with now, globally, if Trump continues to push this policy and if China continues to respond this way, and I could talk about this in terms of the internet, data flows, all kinds of other things, as well as just capital flows and goods flows. But what we're left with now is the end, or the sort of slow sunset of the era of neoliberalism and the dawn of an era of neo-mercantilism. And that has all kinds of cascading effects, not just for the US-China relationship, but right around the world. The last point I'll make is about the grand bargain. And the grand bargain being a recognition of something that I think underlies a lot of this. The United States, for a long time, was very good at bipolar competition, right? If we think about the Second World War, the Allies and the Axis. Think about the Cold War, the Western camp versus the Eastern camp, right? The Soviet Union versus the United States. Bipolar competition. Us versus them, right? The US is pretty good at that over a long time. The strategic thinkers know what's going on with that. And that's where I think some of the, in my view, erroneous thinking of people like Graham Allison or John Mearsheimer about the inevitability of conflict with the rising power from the status quo power comes from. It comes from that place of an assumption that there will be a bipolar competition in the absence of anything else. So what's the ideal? If you can get out of that bipolar competition, unipolar hegemony, right? That's what the US wants. That's what they think they have, right? That the US just runs the whole world, right? That you have kind of Pax Americana, but on an even higher level of magnitude, right? That the whole world is reliant upon US hegemony. That certainly is what most American politicians and many strategic thinkers for the last 35 years have believed, really since the end of the Cold War. I don't think that's a valid belief either. I think it's fairly clear that even the United States is not strong enough, big enough, or growing fast enough to actually achieve that. So what does China think about the world order and where it's going? China's assumption is that no one is strong enough to achieve unipolar hegemony, A, and B, bipolar competition is a losing battle. You don't want bipolar competition with the United States if you're China. Probably going to lose, probably going to end up in the Soviet Union. Not worth it. What's the better solution? Multipolarity balance of power. Right? Multipolar balance of power is definitely the consensus view among Chinese international relations scholars and policymakers of what would be a good global order. Furthermore, many assume that that's where the world is headed anyway, and that that's actually quite a good thing. And so to the extent that the US withdraws and China can fill some gaps, that the US is no longer a single global leader, there's a chance to push this agenda of multipolar balance of power. A grand bargain would be fantastic from China's point of view because it would be a recognition of just such an order. And indeed would in fact be reminiscent of what I think in the back of many people's minds underlies this idea that this would be a good international order, which is that such a grand bargain would indeed resemble the bargain that came out of the so-called Congress of Vienna in 1815, following the Napoleonic Wars, which ensured 100 years of peace in Europe, right? And that multipolar balance of power is where things should be going. The very last point I'll make is, what do you think the United States thinks of multipolar balance of power? They don't like it. Why don't they like it? And he said, because they don't see 1815, they see 1914 when they think of a multipolar balance of power. They think of all of these complex alliances and too many players and the possibility of escalation being just too high, right? Sort of accidental or inadvertent escalation, sort of sleepwalking into conflict, and the inability to ensure stability in an inherently unstable world of a multipolar nature. And so that fundamental conflict of thinking and systems of thought, I think, underlies some of the conflict in terms of where people are assuming things will go or ought to go, and can get in the way of what little attempt at cooperation or even dialogue may still be there. I'll stop.
Thank you, Bill. I'll come to you immediately, and then we'll open it up. But just so if all of you could kind of, so as an I worked in the Foreign Office, for some years. I think we always kind of thought of this idea of endgame, right? We like the idea of endgame, okay? And historically, the Kantian perpetual peace, end of history, rules-based system, wasn't that Rudd, our old friend Kevin Rudd? So I think with China, obviously, the endgame of economic engagement leading to political change, that didn't work, right? We know that. Thinking more prosaically, so aware of the nuances and depth that you've alluded to, Bill, and all the other speakers. For me, if you've got a transactional president, endgame would, so it must be quantifiable, it must be quantifiable, it must be tangible. So I think therefore, it would be interesting to hear your views on this. So I think there are 4 things that a grand deal would need to address. First is access to the Chinese market. Is that right? I mean, access to the Chinese market. Americans going in with equal access, they've wanted that for years, and getting
Since
good
John
deals.
Hay.
Yeah, I mean, so this is not a new thing, right? I mean, second is balanced trade. I mean, for all you say about it, I mean, the idea that magically this 400 billion, it's going to be American jobs, right? It's going to all go back. Americans are going to be producing toys and things or whatever. You know, in fact, most exports from China to America are high tech right now. I mean, but this will all be going back to America. So balanced trade. The third, I presume, is that you'd be interested to hear your views on this, Leslie. Institutionalization of American advantage in terms of this must be a system that Trump will achieve, which means America says you could carry on being number one. I mean, that's got to be part of it, right? And the fourth, which is a tricky one, is Chinese contribution to public goods in terms of security. You know, all of this obsession with people paying for defense, upping it to 2 or 3%. China enjoys massive advantages through America supplying public goods in the world seaways, the Mediterranean, and elsewhere, and it must start, you know, paying for that. In all of those 4 areas, as far as I can see, China could come out on top. It could basically win, you know, it could kind of work these to this advantage. But in terms of the prosaic stuff of what an actual deal would be, is that sort of, would you agree with that? Or is it something that's completely irrelevant? Or is there some other dimension to it? So Leslie, first we want to address the thing and then come to that. That would be great.
I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, I think that you're right about some of the discrete things that the U.S. And not just Trump, but you know, a number of leaders have wanted, especially access to the Chinese market, balanced trade, institutionalized. Sure. Is there actually strategic thinking along these lines coming out of the Trump administration that is actively seeking to push towards this kind of grand bargain? I would be shocked if there were, because as we know, you know, the individuals that are influential and those who have formal positions have different views and seem to want different things. So I don't think there is a level of coherence either from the president or from the people around him on what a deal would look like. I do think that Biden had coherence, whether we agreed or disagreed. There was a coherent vision articulated at many different moments by Jake Sullivan, especially on the economic side of it, but also Kurt Campbell and others. So I think there was a real coherence there. But I do want to add one thing, which is that it is true that Americans like to go, we're number one. You know, it's sports, just like, but they don't really say who number 2 is. It's not actually, I mean, if you really watch it, and you know, I lived in the US for decades and decades, and I'm still there pretty much every month. But now I see it a little bit from the outside because I've been here since '07, more here than there. And every time I go back and they're like, we're number 1. And I realize it's not really about, unless it's a football game, it's not really about somebody else. It's just like, it just feels good to be first. It doesn't really matter who's number 2, as long as they're not taking our stuff or making us feel insecure or threatening us. And in that sense, there's a sensibility about Americans that is isolationist. But my stronger point is, I do not believe that there is a dominant or even second position in the U.S. that is seeking for the U.S. to be number 1 anymore. And you sort of said it yourself, right? I also personally don't think that Trump is isolationist. I do think that he doesn't want to lead in any civic or globally minded way if you're talking about leadership as being about public goods provision or rules provision or anchoring the world. But I don't think any longer that the public opinion data, the policy, or the leadership suggests that the U.S. ambition is any longer about U.S. dominance. And closing point. I have never heard an American talk about multipolarity and refer to 1914. It's a war that doesn't really exist in the popular narrative about the United States. I was it's really remarkable as an American who comes to London to learn quite how important the First World War is here. And that is just not the case for the United States. For some academics, yes. But generally speaking, the Second World War and the Cold War. But First World War doesn't really feature.
Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what you're talking about in terms of what a grand bargain could look like, those are the sorts of the things that it could include. I guess what I was trying to, when I was speaking, what I was trying to talk about is what I think might be the orientation of some people in the Trump administration. But I agree that actually, even though we talk this time about Trump 2.0, all the talk is about, this time he's got the loyalists with him. We're not going to go through that period that we had in Trump 1.0, where he had, the Mnuchin's and the Gary Cohns from Goldman Sachs on the one hand, and he had the Steve Bannons and the Navarros and the Lighthisers on the other hand. It's going to be more coordinated. I think on the China front, the overall picture is it's more divided within the administration than has yet sort of come to light, because we haven't really got to China because he's doing Ukraine and Gaza. But so I think that actually, in reality, the answer to this idea of there being a grand bargain is probably more to Bill's point about Trump being a narcissist and how China plays that. And I think that in the reality, the length of time that these sorts of agreements take, the political realities that Trump might face. I mean, the popularity rating is quite high, but it's slipping already. He might face problems if inflation does get going. He might face problems if what Doge is doing proves to be more unpopular than when the reality of what it means on the ground becomes clear. I just think that China probably looks at it and goes, yeah, we can see this guy off, actually, and it's 4 years, and maybe we hope for somebody better to come along.
You remember?
And we can do, and therefore we can do something. Maybe we do something that Trump can sell as a grand bargain, but it's more like the Phase 1 trade agreement that we saw last time. That it's kind of something that suits Trump, but China doesn't really have to commit to. And as we've seen in reality, they haven't really lived up to those. That agreement at all.
You remember when we were in Beijing in 2019, and we were talking about this, the narcissist versus the sociopath. I'm not going to say who the sociopath is, but China in their system trains.
That was you talking about
with the narcissist, talking about the sociopath. But yeah, I think historically narcissists usually don't win. I think so Bill, if you reserve comment on that question, we'll do some questions.
There was something I was going to say there.
Do you want to say it now?
If I could, because it speaks directly to some of these points, which is, I agree that the U.S. self-estimation is beginning to shift away from sort of this assumption that we're the unipolar hegemon, but it's shifting towards, I think, and we could argue about this, and I'd be curious to argue afterwards if you'd like, about whether or not it's shifting towards a consensus, which I think it is, that the next best option is bipolar competition, right? The next best option is the fight against the other superpower, the other camp, the other bloc. That multipolarity is a step down from that in the minds of most mainstream thinkers about foreign policy in the United States. The second quick point on 1914, I don't think people are making that analogy explicitly in U.S. popular discourse. Academics, yes. Underlying the thinking about multipolarity is a fear, I think, of exactly that kind of scenario. That whole literature in IR about the causes of World War I, I think, lies under a lot of that thinking. I'll stop if you want me to stop, because you seem to want to go to the question. So
yes, and no, I'll give you first divvy when that. So is that? Have you got the mic? So I think the gentleman here, and then there's two there. Gentleman, and
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. One of Professor Hurst's points, I think it was number 3 out of 4, was about filling the gaps. This is something that China has been doing for decades. The new Silk Road. There are much more in around Africa, such as Mauritius, and we've seen that with the Shebas problem. And I would have thought that this would be a real problem for the US, but I don't think I've ever read anything about any president thinking it was a problem. Maybe it isn't.
Thank you. The gentleman, yeah.
Would Trump defend Taiwan, and if so, how?
Good. And there may be one more. Any other? Yeah, the gentleman over there. I'll come to you later, Mark. The gentleman over there, yeah.
Harrison.
Yeah, it's just there, yeah.
Thank you for the talk. My name is Hari. I'm a student from SOAS. My question is regarding the Grand Deal. So one aspect of it is to push for economic reforms inside China. But there are two considerable challenges for it, right? There is one, a demographic challenge that China faces. And the second thing is the emphasis has been on self-reliance for decades for China, right? So there has been reports that they have been preparing for these kind of sanctions from the last term of Trump. So how is this possible as part of the Grand Deal? Thank you.
So maybe we come to you first of all, Bill.
Oh, okay. I'll try to address all three of those in order, more or less. So in terms of filling gaps, it's not so much that the U.S. retreat from global leadership is opening gaps in Africa. The U.S. was never really on the ground in Africa, much, I think, to its own disadvantage. I think that Africa is a tremendous blind spot in American foreign policy, that it could very usefully cultivate 55 good relationships on that continent, and that would do a lot of good for the United States and for at least some African countries. So it's not so much a gap being left by the Americans there. Where I do see gaps being left by U.S. foreign policy are in parts of East and Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia more noticeably than East Asia. South Asia. The Pacific Islands, hugely. We haven't talked about that at all. But all of these pacts of free association and so on that the U.S. has had with Pacific Island nations are fraying, and the U.S. is not there. And their presence is a lot thinner than it used to be in economic as well as strategic terms, and China is trying to fill that gap. And that's potentially extremely dangerous for the American security agenda in the Pacific, if it still has one, which increasingly I'm not sure. So that's the kind of gap I'm thinking about primarily. Would Trump defend Taiwan? That question is very much in the front of everyone's mind in Taipei on the visits I've had there recently. My sense is that there is a consensus there that Trump's policy on Taiwan is probably pretty solid, that there is a group of people in Trump's orbit who are sort of Taiwan hawks, and that if there's anybody that's really going to have sway, it would be them. I don't know, honestly, if Trump fully understands the Taiwan Relations Act. I don't know what his opinion of Biden's more forceful articulation of certain provisions of that act, although he passed it off as a flub. He did it 4 times. I think it was real. I don't know what their opinion of that is. And I'm not sure how much the U.S. is committed really to ensuring that Taiwan will have the defense capabilities that the president wants, but that the legislature is a little bit less sanguine about, just in the immediate term. But my bet, if I had to make one, is that yes, the U.S. policy on Taiwan is relatively secure and consistent and probably won't change too much unless there's a grand bargain, which I don't think there will be because of 2 reasons that I'll come back to in a second. To speak very quickly to the last question, which was on risks for China more systemically, is that right?
No, the reforms inside China, economic reforms inside China.
Economic reform inside China.
As part of the deal, is it possible?
Oh, no, because China will never do anything in terms of economic reform because of U.S. pressure or in any deal with the United States. Forget that. Economic reform inside China is always on the agenda, but the fundamental question is really, can you solve this problem of over-reliance on investment, and particularly state-directed investment that crowds out things like consumption and private sector investment? Is there a way really to upgrade across numerous sectors and to increase domestic consumption and rely less on exports as a means of economic growth? And this demographic issue has actually been around for a long time. 25 years ago, I was doing research on pensioners, And in some cities, there were already more pensioners than there were contributors to the pension system, right? And that's 25 years ago. And it's gotten worse and worse and worse and worse. So yes, it's real, but it's not new. And so finally, in terms of the grand bargain, the reason I don't think it will happen is because the 4 points that Kerry mentioned, I think are mostly not on the table. I don't think those will, either the US or China will take each of them off the table. And unless they're all on the table, I don't think we could get there. But more fundamentally, at a conceptual level, such a grand bargain would indeed be a recognition of legitimate spheres of influence on the level that we're talking about, perhaps the Trump administration recognizing with regard to Russia, which certain international relations scholars and advocates in the US have been pushing for, in fact, for years. If that comes through, I may be wrong, but I don't think that kind of deal with that kind of recognition, at least not explicitly, is likely to come through with regard to Russia. And I think it would be off the table in terms of China. So long as it is, I don't think there'll be a real grand deal, just a fake one, like the trade agreement of the first time.
Great, thank you. Yeah, just, maybe Leslie, and then if you think Andrew will go on. Yeah.
Yeah, one point of maybe clarification, and I suspect we agree on this, but you're right about the academic, the IR realist literature and scholarship on multipolarity and some of the other comments that you've made. But I would argue that realist scholars in international relations have had very little influence, actually, on U.S. foreign policy. That liberal international relations scholars have had much more influence historically on, and if you look at the democratic peace agenda, if you look at liberal internationalism, it's really the liberal internationalism that has had the influence. As I'm sort of reflecting on this, with the U.S., therefore, can they contend with multipolarity? In some ways, the big question under Trump is, what happens to the alliance system? Because that's really been the U.S. way of contending with shifting power structures for 7 decades, and you see that as things have changed, right? The U.S.-India partnership, which is pretty serious and getting more and more serious, is a recognition of the distribution of power between the U.S. and China, but also of India's rising influence. So, we assume that Donald Trump doesn't care about alliances, won't invest in them, is wary of them. But if that plays out, then the U.S. has a lot more to worry about, and what happens then? ? On Taiwan, I guess I would argue that Donald Trump, whether by design or by absence of planning, has moved the U.S., as you've indicated, squarely back into its more recent pre-Biden history, which is a policy of strategic ambiguity. We just don't know what he will do. That's exactly what U.S. policy was supposed to be, that China wasn't sure whether the U.S. would come to Taiwan's defense, that Taiwan wasn't sure, that nobody was really sure which way it would go, and it was a way of deterring both China and Taiwan. And, obviously Biden, either by design or, age, moved towards strategic clarity. And Donald Trump has got us right back. We just don't know. And so, right now, I would argue the policy is strategic ambiguity. What I think he will do is be quite transactional. And we've seen hints of this. Give us more, make trade better if you want us to continue to provide you arms and other things that make you feel secure. So I think he'll be transactional, but with the goal of keeping that relationship as it is. And final thing on the spheres of influence, it's gonna hit many rubber roads. Japan, South Korea, India. Where does Europe sit in all of that? I mean, I just don't think it's neither realistic nor feasible nor desirable nor achievable. So I don't think it's where we're heading. It's just that there are anachronistic elements of it that are jumping at us, like Greenland and Panama and Canada, that make us think, oh my God, he's going for spheres of influence. No, he wants a Western Hemisphere sphere of influence for the United States. That does not mean that he wants to give China a sphere of influence, or even Russia.
So maybe Isabel. I know, Isabel, and then Martin. And we'll take 4 questions and have the final wrap. Yeah,
great, thanks very much. A couple of quick things. We've seen Trump trashing NATO, at least in speech, Do you think he would take the same view of AUKUS and the Quad, and reasons why or why not? And the second question is really, it strikes me that in the domestic politics of both of these powers, the narrative of confrontation plays a pretty important role. And as both of them are going to have more difficulties, the Chinese economy is not picking up, and people are not spending, et cetera, the US economy is likely to suffer from the Trump effect quite badly, that it would be quite difficult. This is a question. How difficult would it be in those circumstances to drop the narrative of confrontation and do a U-turn? Because it looks quite tricky to me. You need someone to blame, right?
And then maybe Martin, so just behind, and if you just hand it back, yeah. Martin, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for all your insights this evening. I wanted to ask about people-to-people dialogue. Obviously, you talked a lot about the big picture, but people-to-people in terms of the education sector and travel and tourism. Obviously, in education, the UK competes with the USA in attracting students from China. On the travel market, China overtook the USA as the biggest outbound market in 2019, and it's recovered, of course, but not totally yet. So it's interesting how these two sectors can move forward, which are obviously very key to our economy, the US economy, and so on.
Thank you, Martin. And then a couple more. So the gentleman here, and then the gentleman over there. So yeah. And yeah.
Can someone just talk about the US debt and China's willingness and ability to actually finance?
Okay, very good. And then finally, the gentleman over there. Yeah.
Trump may not want China and Russia to have spheres of influence, but it's arguable that he doesn't want China to have a sphere of influence over Russia. And in that context, you could argue that some of the things that he's currently doing, his negotiations, in apostrophes, with Ukraine is consistent with that.
Thank you. So if we do it in the order of the speakers, I think the treasuries you referred to have come down. I checked yesterday, it was in 2018, I think it was 3.5 trillion in no, it was 3.5 the
FX reserves.
Foreign exchange reserves, and they'd come down to 3.2. So I'm assuming the treasuries have come down as a proportion of that, but no one knows. Andrew.
Well, on the I'll take the one on treasuries. I mean, I think the data shows that China's holdings of U.S. treasuries, just narrowly U.S. treasuries, have come down. I think the latest data showed they tick down again. But I sort of defer to people like Brad Setzer on this and the latest stuff that I've read from him. But he talks about how what's actually happening is that China may be moving out of treasuries, but it's buying more other quasi-government debt in the US. So, for example, bonds issued by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and those sorts of institutions. So that overall, it's hard to sort of detect a pattern where China's actually, selling down its holdings of US government or quasi-government debt. And personally, I've never been overly worried about this situation because it's a lose-lose situation. I mean, China can't, if you, it's the old thing about, if I owe the bank, $500, that's my problem. If I owe the bank $10 million, it's the bank's problem. And, so China, but, in practical terms, China can't really offload its treasury holdings to any great degree because the market would plunge and the value of its other remaining holdings. And also, just practically, it's quite hard to sell that much of that amount of treasuries in one go because you've got to, somebody else has got to buy them, and who would do that in those circumstances? So, and also because of the way the sort of trading system that's emerged works, China needs to find a home for its dollar earnings that it generates from its exports. What's the safest place to put those dollar earnings? Well, there's nothing there's nothing safer than U.S. Treasuries. So structurally, I don't think there's a way that China can substantially reduce it. Now, every now and then, of course, it doesn't mind to have headlines that come out that say, oh, China sold off its treasury holdings again. But I think if you look at the data sort of in detail, A, it's not clear that that's actually the case. And B, I don't think it's been done to a level that should actually cause any alarm in the US. And I don't think it's something that China could do. Now, obviously, of course, just a final point on this. I mean, ultimately, I suppose, Trump at least says he wants to reduce the fiscal deficit and bring the US budget back into balance. He's obviously going to struggle with that if he's going to do tax cuts without, substantial cuts to either healthcare or defense, the big line items in any modern state's budget. So, this situation is going to persist, but it's not something that I overly worry about in terms of China having massive leverage over the US.
Great, thank you. Final minute. Anything
Okay.
you want to say?
Oh, sorry.
On the confrontation question, I think it's super interesting. Can you unwind this deep public sentiment that's anti-China in the United States? I think you can kind of keep it at bay pretty darn easily because Americans are mostly domestically focused. And there is an enemy within argument going on right now. Anti-woke, anti-deep state, anti-liberals, anti-elite, anti-Washington, anti-New York, anti-California. There is such a predominant domestic focus on this that I think that, it's not that it goes away, but it's a long ways away. And Americans care more than anything else about their families and their quality of living. And that's not a bad thing. It doesn't have to be a bad thing, actually. But I do think it could be a good thing in terms of the U.S.-China relationship. And on education, it's incredibly sad how few U.S. students go to China now. The numbers are it's so low.
In the hundreds.
It's under 1,000, right?
Yeah.
It's so low. And it's probably not going to come up anytime soon. And it's at our peril that Americans don't understand and won't understand China. We made this mistake with Iran. And it's now a huge mistake with China.
Thank you. Final words to Bill.
Yeah, let me speak very, very quickly on the Treasury issue and then on the Russia-China issue. And I won't have time to get to the others, unfortunately, because I know we're just about out of time. On the Treasuries, international reserve currencies are sticky, right? The UK stopped being the world's largest economy 80 years before sterling stopped being the world's reserve currency, right? So the US is still the world's largest economy. The dollar is still definitely the world's reserve currency. If you're China, you're worried sick about capital flight. Right? That's why there's so many capital controls and you can't move money out of China, and it's so difficult to get anything done in terms of a transaction that involves taking capital out of the country because capital flight is a very real fear for the Chinese government. So if you think capital flight is possible or even happening, and you think that's going to undermine your currency, which you're very keen to maintain within a fairly small trading band, you absolutely need the largest reserve possible of the world's reserve currency to counteract that should such a adverse trend occur, right? And so in that sense, China has much more to lose by not buying or selling off US treasuries than the US is losing by China holding those treasuries. And in fact, the US gains a lot by China holding those treasuries. It kind of offshores a lot of the debt and inflationary pressure that the US economy otherwise would have to absorb. So it's not something that China can easily unwind, nor is it something the US should really want them to think about unwinding. When we think about Russia and China, great powers don't really have spheres of influence over each other. And Russia, for the time being at least, is still a great power. And to the extent that China is supportive of Russia's position in the Ukraine war or more broadly, that's not necessarily because it has a influence over Russia or a huge affinity even for Russia's position, but rather to try to ensure that Russia remains a global power capable of balancing the United States and Japan. And that's really from where China sits what this is about. There was a resistance, I think, in an earlier time say 1950s and 60s, especially 60s, to the attempts by the USSR to exert a sphere of influence over China before China was really any kind of great power. But there's never really been an attempt, I would say, by China to exert sphere of influence kind of control over Russia. Russia's too big and it's not useful as such a vassal. It's more useful as a great power in its own right that can balance others.
Thank you very much. So thank you for our wonderful speakers. Thank you to the Policy Institute. The report is online. Tonight we witness a new historic moment, a movement. Leslie has inspired me to start a movement about this thing about, we stop being analytic. Tonight we're going to start the moi movement. Make us analytic again. Thank you very much.